So The Expanse is a really kick-ass series, and I'm talking about both the books and the TV show. The Expanse started out as a 9-book series by James S.A. Corey. The first book, Leviathan Wakes, came out in 2011, and the last book, the 9th book, came out in 2021. It started as a TV adaptation in 2015 by the Sci-Fi Channel, and then was later taken over by Amazon Prime Video. And the TV series just wrapped up its 6th and final season in early 2022. Today, I'm going to be talking about just book 1, Leviathan Wakes, and all the episodes of the show that covered the material in book 1, which was the entirety of season 1, plus the first 5 episodes of season 2. So if you've only seen season 1 of the show, there will be definitely some spoilers in here. And heads up, this entire video is just going to be spoilers. So if you don't want to know what happens, this isn't the video for you. I'm going to be talking about my in-depth thoughts on the differences between the book and the show, and why I think some things were stronger in the book and why I thought some things were stronger in the show, things that I noticed that they did differently, and then at the end I'll give my kind of overall thoughts on which one I liked better. So stay tuned for that, and I'll see you after the break. Hey y'all, howdy, welcome to One for the Books. I'm Sandra Broadwell. I actually came to The Expanse via the TV show. My brother was a big fan of the TV show. Years ago, I think during season 2 is when he said he started watching it, and he tried really hard to convince me to watch it, and I never got around to it until the pandemic hit, and then my husband and I watched it together, and so we finished it up in early 2022. So I actually watched the entire series before I started on the books, but then last year, after the series wrapped up, I convinced my mom and my brother and my husband to do like an Expanse book club with me. So we actually read all the books at the same time and then had discussions about them. And that really enhanced my love of the series to be able to share it with my people. I took a lot of comments during our discussion. So some of the things I'm going to say today are actually things that I stole from them or like notes that I took during those discussions, because I think some of what they said was really insightful as well. If you've read the book or watched the show, be sure to let me know down in the comments below what you liked or didn't like about it and what you think of my takes on it as we move forward. So, plot synopsis. The first book has 2 main point of view characters. The first is James Holden. He's the executive officer of an ice hauler ship called the Canterbury. The second is Detective Miller, who is a cop on Ceres Station in the Belt. Miller is assigned to find a missing young woman named Julie Mao, who is the daughter of billionaire business mogul Jules Pierre Mao. We already know from the prologue of the book that Julie was on board a ship called the Scopuli. Holden's crew on the Canterbury receive a distress call from the Scopuli while out on their regular ice run and decide to investigate. Holden takes a small team aboard, but before they make it back to the Canterbury, several stealth ships appear out of nowhere and destroy it. On board their little shuttle, Holden broadcasts a message to the solar system about the Canterbury's destruction and implicating the MCRN, Mars, in the attack. Riots break out back on Ceres Station when the Belters hear Holden's message and have finally had enough of being taken advantage of by the Enners. Mars claims they had nothing to do with the attack, and an MCRN ship called the Donnager arrives to investigate. On board the Donnager, Holden and what's left of the crew are kept in containment so they can be questioned individually about what happened. But while they're there, the stealth ships come back and attack the Donnager. The Donnager is overwhelmed and boarded, and the MCRN tries to get Holden and his people off the ship because they're the only witnesses that could potentially prevent war in the system. A bunch of people die in the attempt, but they eventually escape on a ship which they rename the Rocinante. Miller, in the meantime, is investigating Julie Mao's disappearance, and he finds a message from her dad warning of an impending attack that was sent 2 weeks before all this shit hit the fan. He also finds out that Julie was a member of the OPA, the Outer Planets Alliance. He takes what he finds back to his boss, and she tells him to drop the case. Miller has become obsessed with Julie at that point, though, and doesn't drop the case. And then when his boss finds out, he gets fired. He then spirals into a deep depression because being a cop was his whole life and identity, and he decides he needs to prove himself by getting to the bottom of the case regardless. The crew of the Rocinante want to get to the bottom of what's going on and end up on a space colony called Eros to track down some answers. Miller finds out that this crew is alive and that they were on the Scopuli, so he also goes to Eros to find them. They find Julie on Eros, but she's already dead and she's covered in this alien fungus-looking stuff. Shortly after they find Julie, the entire station calls an emergency because there's been some sort of supposed radiation leak, and all these armed security guards appear and start herding the civilians into radiation shelters. The Rossi crew realize that something is up and they try to escape the guards and discover that the security people are actually infecting everyone on board with this alien fungus. But the crew escapes Eros just in time and take Miller with them, but millions of civilians die. They find out that the stealth ships that attacked the Scopuli were actually manufactured on Earth, and once again, Holden sends out a broadcast to the solar system to share this information, which basically starts a war between Earth and Mars. They then find out that this alien fungus is called the protomolecule and was actually discovered by a company called Protogen, and they're the ones responsible for attacking Eros with it. Protogen is Jules Pierre Mao's company, who is Julie's dad. And Protogen has been manipulating Earth and Mars all along to start this war as a distraction from their evil scientific experiments. The crew team up with the OPA and go to kick Protogen's ass because they're pissed that all these civilians on Eros were killed for their science experiment. After they destroy the Protogen lab, they need to destroy Eros before the inspection can spread throughout the solar system. So the OPA sends some ships filled with nukes to destroy Eros and blow it to smithereens. Miller decides to die aboard Eros with Julie because he's deeply depressed and feels his life has no meaning now that the case has been solved. But Eros has become sentient after having millions of alien-infected humans on board, and it dodges the attack and then begins hurtling toward Earth at insanely fast speeds. Miller realizes it's Julie Mao who's actually controlling the flight of Eros with her alien-fused brain. He finds her and wakes her up and convinces her not to crash into Earth, and she diverts Eros and it crashes into Venus at the last second instead, and Earth is saved. In the epilogue, we find out that these alien tower structures are appearing on Venus around the site of the crash. So, damn, that's a lot. This book is a chunker, if you can't tell. I just want to start by saying that I love this series. I love the show. I love the books. But I do want to talk about the differences that I noticed and things that I liked and didn't like about both. So one of the interesting things that I found as someone who watched the show first and then started reading the books is that Leviathan Wakes actually starts out exactly like the show, like scene for scene, sometimes almost word for word. It's extremely similar, which is really cool, actually. It didn't feel repetitive at all. It felt like getting acquainted with an old friend in a way. James S.A. Corey is actually a pen name for two people who wrote the books together, and they were both very involved with the show and its development, which I think is really apparent. The show does a really amazing job, and it just feels very real when you're immersed in it. The authors said that they wanted to make space kind of like its own character and not just like this backdrop setting, which is very apparent. There's this huge communication lag across the solar system. It can take days for messages to go back and forth. The ships are constructed vertically because of the drive and the need for gravity, which was super cool and not something that you see in a lot of sci-fi. When they're pouring drinks in the belt, it has this Coriolis effect of the liquid as it goes from the bottle to the glass, which was super cool. The speed that they talk about is expressed in G-forces instead of miles per hour or, any metric that we use for speed on Earth, because speed is really relative. They're basically constantly accelerating until they reach the halfway point of where they're going, and then they flip the ship and basically accelerate in the other direction, which is decelerating until they get to their destination. The vacuum is also portrayed very realistically. When people are exposed to a vacuum, it's actually not a huge amount of atmosphere is different. And so it's not like your eyeballs get sucked out or anything crazy. You can survive in a vacuum. It's not a pleasant experience, but you can actually survive in a vacuum for a very, very short amount of time. Also, they just did a really good job, I think, of expressing the hardship of being a belter and the water shortages and how precious it is to the people of the belt. And I thought that was juxtaposed really well in the show, because it seemed we would be going from this water crisis situation on the belt, and then it would switch to a scene on Earth, and it almost always, it seemed when we were back on Earth, the scene would start with some form of water. It was either zooming in over the ocean to get this view of the city, or it would be zooming out on someone turning on a faucet or something like that. And I just thought that was really, really well done in a really subtle way to show the abundance and scarcity between the inner and outer planets. I also thought the casting for the show was absolutely phenomenal. I don't think any of them could have been done better. Avasarala, Miller, these people were the characters 100%. The acting was out of this world. I did think that Amos seemed a lot more unhinged in the show than he does, at least in the first book. In the first book, you can tell he's a little off, but he seems more normal, at least in Leviathan Wakes, than he does in the show. When you see Amos, you really realize that he's different. I think that's something that they ramped up in later books, but it wasn't quite as noticeable in the first book. I thought Miller was more interesting in the books because he was a point of view character. You got more of his inner thoughts. And something that you learn about Miller is that he is, he's kind of this broody character, but he's he's a really good detective. And so in that way, he's sort of a chameleon. Like he tries to blend into any environment that he's a part of to be able to manipulate people into giving him information. And so in the show, you don't really get as much of a sense of like who Miller actually is because he's so good at his job. And there just wasn't really a way, I think, for the show to portray his personality any differently. But because of that, in the show, I didn't feel quite as connected to Miller as I did when I read the book. One of the main differences that I noticed when I watched the show versus read the book is the differences between the Belters and the Inners. The book does a better job of showing us the physical differences between Belters and Inners. And so Belters are, like I said earlier, tall and lanky. They have larger heads. They're very graceful in low G or zero G environments. That was especially said of Naomi a lot, whereas other people were a little more fumbly or clumsy because they didn't grow up in that sort of environment. And that was true of all Belters. And obviously, the people that were chosen to cast Belters aren't these like crazy, tall, lanky, big-headed people. You know, they're just people. And so one of the things that I thought they did really well in the show to kind of show the difference between Belters and Inners was really playing up that like Belter Creole dialect that they have. And sometimes in the show, I found it very hard to understand what the Belters were saying versus in the book, you know, you could kind of read it and sound it out and go over it a couple times and be like, okay, I think I get what they're saying. Whereas in the show, it was just like, I have no idea what they're talking about right now. But I think that was for the point that the Belters are really like this whole separate culture. And so I think that was done really well. And that was one of the things that I really first noticed is that right off the bat in the book, it describes Naomi as like towering over Holden because she is so tall. And the person that they cast to play Naomi is actually quite short, but that didn't bother me whatsoever. Like, once again, I think the person they chose to play Naomi was a really perfect choice. I also really liked the fact that the authors chose Holden and Miller as the two point of view characters in this book because their personalities are really like juxtaposed. Holden believes that people deserve to know the truth, and he is kind of recklessly naive about it. And because he wants the people to know the truth, you know, he basically like inadvertently starts a war between Earth and Mars because he isn't strategic about how that truth is disseminated. Versus Miller believes that the truth is a weapon that should be used strategically to get people to do what you want them to do. That's just a really interesting like character dynamic that kind of portrays Holden and Miller as these like opposing forces, which was a really cool storytelling device. And Naomi later on in the books tells Holden that he's starting to sound like Miller, and she uses that as an insult that kind of to Holden feels like a slap in the face a little bit. So one of the big differences I noticed that they changed between the book and the show was the way that they handled the Canterbury responding to the distress call of the Scopuli. In the show, the crew gets this distress call from the Scopuli, and they're basically like, well, if we go respond to this distress call, it's going to put us like way behind schedule. We're not going to get our bonuses, blah, blah, blah. And they decide basically not to go investigate. But then Holden is kind of haunted by that, and he plays back the recording over and over again. And then he hears what he thinks is a human voice asking for help, like coded in the message. And then he feels unable to turn away from the situation. And so he turns the ship around and is like, no, we're going to investigate this. But it's kind of kept as a secret that he was the one that made that call. And later on, after the Canterbury has, everyone on board has died, and it's just Holden and his small crew, when they find out that he was the one that was responsible for this, and basically like because of his actions, everyone on the Canterbury died, they're like really pissed about that. And that's like a big point of contention in the show. It plays out very differently in the book because even though Holden is the one who says out loud that, yes, we need to go investigate what's going on with the Scopuli, it was basically like more of a crew consensus. And like, even though they were dragging their feet and no one really wanted to go, it was just generally understood that that's what they were going to do. And so that wasn't really a point of drama in the book. Also, I just thought once the remaining survivors of the Canterbury were on board the Donnager, when they start dying one by one in the show, especially because at that point, I didn't know who the main characters were going to be. I thought everyone that was left was going to be a main character, and then several of them die before they escape on the Rocinante. That to me was like really impactful on the show. And I definitely felt the tension was ratcheted up on the show versus in the book during those scenes. Another big difference between the book and the show is that Miller's partner, Havelock, in the show is murdered. And in the book, that does not happen. In the book, actually, that same murder from the show does happen, but it happens to someone else kind of off screen, and it doesn't happen to Havelock. And then Havelock later becomes important in the rest of the story because he goes to work for Protogen, which is the evil corporation, basically, as like a security guard, and he ends up helping them later on. And then he also appears in later books in the series. So the fact that they chose to kill him off right here in the first season was a really interesting choice. But you can tell in the first book, in the first season, that kind of the point of his character was to show this racism between the Belters and the Inners. And because he is an Earther that works as a cop in the Belt, he's pretty universally hated, not only by the citizens of the Belt, but also by his fellow cops. So now I have to talk about my absolute least favorite part of season 1, book 1. Honestly, probably my least favorite part of the series overall, book and show combined, is this relationship between Miller and Julie. I liked it better in the book because once again, we got Miller's kind of inner monologue. We got more of this like PTSD and depression and things that he was feeling and why he latched on to Julie so hard. But I still didn't think it was done super well. And in the show, they did it worse. Basically, in the show, it's just like this weird insta-love sort of feeling where Miller just falls in love with Julie, and she's like 21 and he's like 50, and it's super weird and it doesn't feel justified, especially because in the show they actually kiss right before they die and crash into Venus, and that just felt super unearned. Even if I understood where Miller was coming from, there was no way that Julie should have felt the same way towards Miller because she had literally like just met him. So I just really hated that part, but that didn't really take away because I had already seen like more of the show, because I'd already watched basically the entire series before I read the first book. I went into the first book thinking, I hope I finally understand what that was about. And I didn't really feel better about it after reading the book. I was still just like, I mean, it kind of makes more sense now, but it still just it gives me the ick. I don't like it. I wish they hadn't done that. I wish they had changed it in the show so it made more sense, and they didn't. They made it worse. So yeah, I really would have liked it a lot better if it had been more of like a paternal, like protection feeling that Miller had toward Julie, or, you know, even if he had thought that he was falling in love with her or something, I still just think that it could have been done differently to make it not so cringy, but it was pretty cringy from my perspective. And my family didn't agree with me on this, so you might think completely differently when you read it, and I hope you do. But yeah, I wish that had been handled in a different way. Yeah, that's all there is. But once again, that was really the only part that I didn't vibe with in both the book and the TV show. So then we have to talk about the elephant in the room. And this was definitely the biggest number one change between the book and the show. And that is the fact that in the book, there is no inclusion of a perspective from Earth or the UN or really any sort of solar system-wide politics. It is literally just Holden's perspective as a cop on Ceres and Holden's perspective as the EXO of the Canterbury and the fallout of what happens because of that. In the first season of the show, we get to meet Avasarala, and we get all of this political intrigue about what's going on with Earth and the UN politics and how they're interpreting what they're hearing from Mars and how they felt about James Holden's messages that got cast out to the solar system and what's going on with that. So to me, this was done much better in the TV series because I really liked the breadth and the depth that this went to and how it added a whole nother dimension to the story. And it really showed us how the actions of Holden and his crew were affecting the entire solar system and not just how it was affecting Miller and the belt. And so to me, I felt like that really made their actions seem more impactful rather than just hearing occasionally on the news that these things were happening like outside of the perspectives that we were getting. Especially because I had already seen the show first and I love Avasarala as a character. Like I really love her. I was like, the whole book, I was just waiting for Avasarala to show up. I was like, where's Avasarala? When are we going to get to see her? And she doesn't appear at all in Leviathan Wakes. So I really missed that. Avasarala is introduced in book 2, which is called Caliban's War. But I thought that that level of depth was just missing from the book. So those are most of the differences that I noticed between Leviathan Wakes and season 1 plus of The Expanse. My overall thoughts are, because I really liked the Earth politics and the kind of overall solar system-wide depth of the story, I think I like the first season of the show better than I like the first book of The Expanse. That's where I'm landing on this. There were some things that I definitely thought the book did better, but because the story was so much broader and deeper with the inclusion of Avasarala's perspective in the show, that's what's making me lean towards that half of the scale. So those are my thoughts. I hope that you got something out of this. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. If this video performs well, I will probably do a season 2 versus book 2, a similar kind of thing going on, and might even do the whole series if this turns out well, because I have a lot more to say. But thank you for watching and for hanging out with me while I geeked out about The Expanse. As always, please be kind, read books, and hit the subscribe button below for more bookish, nerdy stuff to come.